Hey everyone! Tonight we're going to dive slowly, quietly, and carefully into one of the most misunderstood topics of medieval life: how intimacy, relationships, and yes, S3X actually happened in the Middle Ages. There are a lot of myths and assumptions about how people lived back then, especially when it comes to something as private and complex as their physical relationships. But tonight we're going to strip away the legends and look calmly at the facts. So lie back, relax, and let's begin. To understand how intimacy worked in the Middle Ages, we first have to step into their world. Not through castles or wars, but through everyday life. In medieval Europe, the rules surrounding S3X weren't just cultural. They were deeply tied to religion, class, and survival. The Catholic Church played a massive role. From roughly the 5th to the 15th century, Christian teachings shaped nearly all public and private behavior, including what was considered acceptable in bed. And believe it or not, the church had very clear rules. S3X was only supposed to happen within marriage, and only for the purpose of having children. Pleasure wasn't forbidden outright, but it was viewed with suspicion, especially if it wasn't tied to reproduction. Most people didn't marry for love. Marriages were often arranged by families, especially among the upper classes. It was more about property, alliances, and continuing a family line. Among peasants, marriage was also practical. It meant sharing land, work, and children who could help in the fields. But regardless of class, once you were married, the church still expected you to follow rules even in your bedroom. Certain days of the week were off-limits. So were periods like Lent, Advent, and other religious holidays. In fact, there were over 100 days a year when S3X was technically forbidden. But did people actually follow those rules? That's where things get more interesting. Behind closed doors, people were often more complicated than the church allowed for. In private, some couples had rich and affectionate relationships. Others, not so much. And not everyone waited until marriage, either. In rural villages, betrothal, a formal engagement, sometimes came with an expectation of intimacy before the wedding itself. This was called handfasting in some regions, and it could function as a trial marriage. If a child was born, the couple was often expected to marry, but not always shamed. The role of midwives and local women was also important. They knew the signs of pregnancy, they helped with births, and sometimes they even shared knowledge, whispered from woman to woman, about how to avoid conception, though these methods were very unreliable. And then there's the matter of consent, which, sadly, wasn't always recognized the way we understand it today. A husband had near total rights over his wife's body in most parts of Europe. The concept of marital RPE didn't really exist in law, and many women had little legal protection once married. At the same time, there were countless folk beliefs and superstitions tied to intimacy. From herbal potions to fertility rituals, many communities blended Christian morality with older pagan traditions, trying to navigate their desires within a world full of fear, faith, and survival. And all of this was happening in tiny cottages, cold stone halls, and wooden houses with no privacy. Most people slept in shared spaces, parents, children, even servants or animals. There were no separate bedrooms, no closed doors, just straw beds, firelight, and whispers in the dark. But what did courtship look like? How did people flirt or fall in love, or even talk about desire in a world where such things were barely allowed? That's exactly what we'll explore next. In the Middle Ages, the path to intimacy began long before marriage, though not always in the way we might imagine. Flirting wasn't done through text messages or glances across crowded rooms. It often started in the fields, at local markets, or at church. These were some of the few public places where young people could see one another without supervision, though even then, eyes were always watching. Among peasants, matchmaking was usually a family affair. Parents kept a close eye on potential matches, judging not just looks or personality, but land, tools, and family reputation. But even within those constraints, young men and women found ways to show interest. A young man might help a woman carry water from the well, or offer her a piece of fruit. A girl might leave a flower where he worked in the fields. These were small gestures, easy to deny, but understood by those who paid attention. In wealthier households, things were more complex. Noble families arranged marriages through negotiations, often starting when children were still very young. Marriages among the upper classes were essentially contracts between families. The young couple might not even meet until the wedding day, or they might exchange only brief letters written by scribes. But even in noble courts, desire found its way. Troubadours and poets sang of courtly love, a highly romanticized, idealized form of affection, often between a knight and a lady he could never have. These stories, filled with longing and restraint, didn't reflect the reality for most people, but they did shape how emotions were expressed. A glance, a poem, or a token, like a handkerchief or ribbon, could carry layers of hidden meaning. Still, physical contact before marriage was dangerous. A woman's virginity was closely guarded, not just for moral reasons, but because it affected property and inheritance. If a noblewoman was suspected of not being a virgin on her wedding night, it could ruin alliances, cause family feuds, or worse. Among commoners, the consequences could include shame, loss of status, or being forced into a marriage to fix the situation. And yet, premarital S3X happened. In fact, in some villages, local customs allowed for more freedom than we might expect. In parts of Germany and England, there was a tradition called bundling, where a young man and woman could lie together in bed, fully clothed or separated by a board, to talk and get to know one another. While the intention was innocent, bundling often led to more than just conversation. If a woman became pregnant, the pressure to marry quickly was immense, but not universal. Some children were born out of wedlock, especially among the lower classes, and although this carried stigma, it was often tolerated if the couple eventually married or if the woman had support from her family. On the other hand, monasteries and convents offered a different path. Not everyone was interested in marriage or intimacy. Some people, especially younger sons or daughters of noble families, were sent into religious life. Monks and nuns took vows of celibacy, dedicating themselves to spiritual work. But even here, human nature persisted. Scandals occasionally emerged. Secret affairs, forbidden letters, or even pregnancies hidden behind monastery walls. Desire, it seems, was never far from any corner of medieval life. But what happened once a couple did marry? What were their first nights like, and how did society, and even the law, get involved in what happened between husband and wife? That's where the story gets even more unusual. Once a couple was married, their first night together wasn't just a personal event. It was, in many cases, a community affair. Today, the idea of a wedding night is private, even sacred. But in the Middle Ages, it was often surrounded by ritual, pressure, and in some cases, very little privacy. The church viewed marriage as a sacrament, but one that had to be physically consummated, that is, sealed through S3X, to be considered fully valid. Without that act, a marriage could be annulled. So it wasn't uncommon for witnesses, often friends or family, to escort the couple to the bedchamber. In noble households, they might even wait outside the door. In some cultures, it was expected that the bed linens would be checked for signs that the bride had been a virgin. This wasn't always done, but the possibility was real. Among royalty and the higher nobility, this went even further. In some cases, scribes or officials recorded that the marriage had been consummated. The act itself remained behind closed doors, but what happened afterward, or didn't, could have political consequences. If the bride became pregnant soon after, the union was seen as successful. If not, rumors could begin to spread. For ordinary folk, the customs were less formal, but the expectations were still there. The newlyweds might be given a shared drink to symbolize unity. Sometimes, they were playfully teased or sung to by their friends before being left alone. But again, alone didn't always mean private. They might be in a shared house with children or relatives nearby, only separated by a curtain or a wooden wall, if that. The act of S3X itself was rarely discussed in detail, but it wasn't entirely hidden either. Church writings, legal records, and even medical texts from the period included descriptions of what was expected. The missionary position was considered the only acceptable way for a married couple to lie together. Anything else was frowned upon or outright condemned as sinful. And while the church did not encourage open conversations about pleasure, many texts written for clergy or physicians did acknowledge that both men and women could, and often did, feel desire. The experience itself varied greatly depending on the couple. Some people had grown up together or had known each other since childhood. Others had barely met. There was no standard age for marriage, but girls as young as 12 and boys as young as 14 could legally marry in many places. That said, most people married a bit later, especially among peasants, when they were physically and financially able to run a household. Unfortunately, power imbalances were common. A young bride might be married to an older man chosen by her family. In those cases, her comfort or consent mattered little. Among the nobility, a marriage might be purely strategic, with the young woman sent far from home to live in a castle or estate she had never seen before. Once the marriage was consummated, the couple was expected to settle into their roles. The husband worked the land or managed property. The wife often managed the household, bore children, and took care of the family's spiritual and practical needs. But life was not stable. Childbirth was dangerous, disease was common, and intimacy, for many, was not a romantic luxury. It was simply part of life's rhythm, expected and unspoken. But what if a couple didn't get along? What if the husband was cruel, or the wife refused her duties? Were there options for divorce, separation, or were they truly bound for life? That question brings us deeper into the hidden tensions of medieval marriage in the modern world. If a marriage fails, there are often legal paths for separation. But in the Middle Ages, the options were far more limited, especially for women. Once a marriage was recognized by the church and consummated, it was seen as a permanent bond. What God has joined together. The saying went, "Let no man put asunder," but real life was messier than doctrine. If a marriage turned sour due to cruelty, neglect, or even impotence, there were a few rare cases where it could be dissolved. The most common grounds were non-consummation or fraud. For example, if one spouse claimed to be able to fulfill their marital role and then physically could not, an annulment might be granted. This wasn't common, and it often required witnesses, public testimony, and the approval of church courts. Impotence was taken seriously, but proving it was another matter. In some regions, a man accused of being impotent could be subject to humiliating public examinations, or even required to demonstrate his ability in front of clerics or appointed inspectors. These tests were invasive and often degrading, but they show how tightly the church monitored even the most personal parts of people's lives. Women, on the other hand, had far fewer rights. If a husband was violent or unfaithful, she might be able to seek a legal separation, meaning they would live apart but remain technically married. She could return to her family, or in rare cases, join a religious order. But full divorce, with the freedom to remarry, was nearly impossible unless the marriage was proven invalid from the start. Among the nobility, separation could become a political issue. If a wealthy landowner wanted to rid himself of a wife, he might attempt to fabricate charges, or simply send her to a convent. There, she would live out her days in prayer and silence, often without her consent. It was not unusual for noblewomen to be locked away for years, their lives forgotten while their husbands remarried or carried on openly with mistresses. And mistresses were a common part of noble life. Kings, dukes, and even some bishops had unofficial partners, often young women from lower ranks who had little say in the arrangement. These relationships were sometimes tolerated, sometimes scandalous, but they rarely disrupted the men's public roles. Among peasants, things were different. Couples argued, drifted apart, or even separated informally, especially in towns where people could disappear into the crowd. But without formal recognition, remarriage was illegal and condemned. So some people simply lived as if they were married to someone new, even if the church disapproved. At the same time, medieval law codes, especially outside the church, were evolving. In certain parts of Europe, local customs allowed for more flexibility. In Scandinavia, for example, some laws permitted divorce for specific reasons. But those were exceptions, not the rule. For most people, once married, that was the end of the story, at least officially. Still, behind closed doors, human behavior didn't always follow the rules. Affairs happened. Secret relationships developed. People fell in love outside their marriages, or grew apart from the ones they were supposed to share life with. And the consequences varied, from quiet suffering to violent retribution. So what about intimacy outside of marriage entirely? How did society deal with S3X that wasn't part of a legal union? What happened to those who broke the rules? The answers, as you'll see, are far more complicated than most people think. Outside the structure of marriage, intimacy in the Middle Ages became both more dangerous and more visible. The Church strictly forbade S3X outside wedlock, calling it sinful and immoral. But despite the rules, or perhaps because of them, forbidden relationships flourished in quiet corners of every city, village, and noble court. Adultery or cheating on a spouse was viewed as a serious offense, especially for women. A married woman caught in an affair could be publicly shamed, beaten, or worse. In some areas, her husband had legal rights to punish her, though how far he went often depended on his status and the local customs. For men, the consequences were usually less severe, especially if the affair was with an unmarried woman. The double standard was clear, and it was widely accepted. Still, secrecy didn't always protect lovers. Gossip traveled fast in small communities. A woman who became pregnant by someone other than her husband had no way to hide the truth for long. In such cases, punishment might come not from the law, but from neighbors through humiliation, exile, or even violence. But there were also places where S3X outside marriage was both tolerated and regulated. The brothels. In many medieval towns, prostitution wasn't hidden, it was organized. Local authorities often approved of it, or at least allowed it to continue, because it was considered a necessary evil. The logic was simple. If unmarried men had no outlet for their desires, they might cause worse trouble. So rather than pretending it didn't happen, cities created designated areas, known as red light districts, where brothels could legally operate. These establishments were usually taxed, and in some cases they were even managed by the town itself. Prostitutes were required to wear special clothing or headscarves to mark their status. They were expected to live apart from respectable women, and they were not allowed to attend certain church services or festivals. Still, their presence was an open secret. Life for these women was harsh. Many entered the trade out of desperation because they were poor, orphaned, or abandoned. Some had been widowed with no way to support themselves. Others were sold into the work by their families. Few had any real choice. Violence, disease, and abuse were common. Protection from the law was minimal. And while some brothels provided a form of shelter, they were also places of control and exploitation. In larger cities, wealthy men might keep mistresses in private residences, hidden away from public view. These women had no official status, but they were often given gifts, money, or even homes in exchange for their silence and companionship. Not everyone judged them harshly. There are records of priests and monks debating whether it was more merciful to forgive such women or condemn them outright. Some saw them as victims, others as temptresses, but almost all agreed that their existence was inevitable. Meanwhile, lovers who met in secret, whether married or not, took great risks. Letters were written in code. Meetings were arranged in forests, in barns, or during festivals when the town was too busy to notice. And yet, love, or at least desire, found a way. But what about the role of the church itself in all this? If the church set the rules, how did its own clergy behave? Were monks and priests truly celibate? Or did they, too, struggle with the same desires as everyone else? To answer that, we'll need to look inside the very walls of the church and uncover what was whispered in silence. In theory, priests, monks, and nuns in the Middle Ages lived lives of purity, devotion, and complete abstinence. Celibacy, the commitment to avoid marriage and all forms of S3 activity, was seen as a way to become closer to God. It was meant to free the soul from earthly distractions, especially those tied to the body. But in practice, the reality was far more complicated. The rule of celibacy wasn't always strictly enforced in the early medieval period. In fact, before the 12th century, many priests were married. Some had families and children, and their positions were passed down father to son like property. It was only after the reforms of the church, especially the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century, that celibacy became mandatory for all clergy in the Western Church. Even after that point, enforcement remained inconsistent. In rural areas, bishops turned a blind eye. Priests kept concubines, women they lived with often for years, and the local communities quietly accepted it. As long as the priest continued his duties, few people protested. Sometimes, the church itself even profited by collecting fines from priests caught in these arrangements, rather than removing them from office. Monasteries and convents, those silent, stone-bound places of prayer and reflection, were not immune either. While many monks and nuns lived disciplined, devout lives, there were always exceptions. Some born from loneliness, others from desire, and some from manipulation and power. In larger abbeys, where dozens of men or women lived in strict routine, temptation crept in slowly. A shared glance in the gardens, a whispered conversation during chores, and sometimes secret meetings in the night. Human needs didn't vanish behind monastery walls. They were simply buried deeper until they found cracks to emerge through. There are surviving records of monks being caught visiting local brothels, or of nuns giving birth in secret and hiding the infants. In some extreme cases, entire convents were shut down after repeated scandals. One bishop in the 14th century complained that a nearby nunnery had become no more than a house of ill repute, used by local men of influence for their own purposes. Confessionals, meant as sacred places of forgiveness, were also spaces where boundaries could be crossed. There are accounts, whispered in trial records, of priests who used their spiritual authority to take advantage of vulnerable women. These cases were often covered up, but occasionally they reached higher authorities and caused brief moments of public outrage before fading again into silence. Of course, these stories didn't represent the majority. Many monks and nuns lived austere, even painful lives, fasting, flagellating themselves, and praying through the night in search of purity. But even they wrote in their diaries and spiritual journals of their struggles with dreams, memories, and temptations that refused to leave them alone. Desire, in other words, respected no vows. But if even the clergy faltered, how did the church continue to hold power over people's most private acts? How did they shape the rules of S3X, love, and punishment for centuries? The answer lies in something more enduring than sermons: confession, control, and the fear of sin. By the 13th century, confession had become a powerful tool in the church's effort to shape and control everyday life, especially when it came to S3X. Every Christian was expected to confess their sins at least once a year, usually before Easter. This wasn't a suggestion. It was law set by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. And with that rule came something quietly revolutionary. The church now had regular access to people's most private thoughts and acts. Priests were instructed to ask about S3X directly. Who had you been with? When? Were you married to them? Did you enjoy it? Did you do anything unnatural or outside of church-approved positions? These were not hypothetical questions. They were part of the confessional handbooks, long, detailed guides written for priests that laid out how to investigate sin and what kind of penance to assign in return. And the rules were not always intuitive. For example, it was considered more sinful to have S3X during daylight than at night. S3X during holy days was a grave offense. Oral or anal acts, even within marriage, were classified as against nature. And pleasure for its own sake, especially for women, was viewed with deep suspicion. The penance for these sins varied. A few days of fasting, pilgrimage, public prayer. In more severe cases, repeated offenses might result in exclusion from communion or even public shame. But the real consequence was deeper, internalized guilt. Generations of men and women grew up believing that their own bodies were dangerous, that desire itself was a weakness, a test from God, or worse, a sign of the devil's influence. And yet, despite the strict teachings, the church's hold wasn't absolute. Lay people, especially in villages and remote towns, didn't always confess in full. They might lie, soften the truth, or avoid certain topics. And while priests were supposed to act as moral guides, they were still members of the community. Some were feared, but others were tolerated, even liked, especially when they showed mercy. Still, the threat of sin hovered constantly over married and unmarried alike. Religious images often showed demons tempting people in bed. Women were warned that excessive desire could mark them as unnatural. Men were told to control their wives to avoid being led astray. The idea of lust as a deadly sin shaped how people talked about, feared, and suppressed their own instincts. Medical theories of the time only reinforced these views. Based on ancient texts, medieval physicians believed that the body was made of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much S3X, they claimed, could unbalance the humors, causing weakness or madness. For women, the advice was even stranger. Some doctors believed that a lack of S3X could cause illness, a theory rooted in the outdated idea of a wandering womb. Others claimed that too much pleasure could make a woman wild or uncontrollable. These ideas, though unscientific, were widely believed. They mixed with sermons, folklore, and local traditions to create a deeply moralized and deeply confused view of the body. And yet, people still lived, married, and loved. They still sought comfort, warmth, and connection. The rules may have been strict, but they were not always followed. Behind the wooden walls of homes and the stone arches of churches, life went on, full of contradiction. So what did intimacy look like in those quiet, private spaces? What happened in the flickering light of candles, under thatched roofs, when no priest was watching? That brings us closer to the real, lived experiences of medieval couples. If you stepped quietly into a medieval home at night, not a castle or a monastery, but an ordinary peasant's cottage, you might be surprised by how close everything was. Space was limited. Privacy was rare. Most families, especially in the countryside, lived in single-room homes made of wood, earth, and straw. Parents, children, and sometimes even livestock shared the same room. There were no doors to close, no locks to turn. At best, there might be a curtain or a partition made of cloth or wood, separating sleeping areas. And yet, in these cramped and humble spaces, intimacy still happened. It often happened late at night, after the fire had been banked and the house had gone still. On beds made of straw or wool-stuffed mattresses laid over wooden planks, couples would lie side by side. There was no candlelight. Candles were expensive. Only the soft glow of embers or the pale light of the moon filtering through a shuttered window. And within that stillness, far from the gaze of priests or neighbors, people touched, whispered, and connected. We know this not from romantic poems or love stories, but from legal documents, diaries, and even old folk songs, many of which contained verses about love, longing, and secret meetings. These weren't idealized tales. They spoke of routine, of comfort, of quiet togetherness shaped by hard work and survival. For married couples, intimacy wasn't always passionate, but it was often regular. In many cases, it followed patterns set by the rhythms of rural life. Planting season, harvest, religious holidays. Even the phases of the moon were believed by some to influence fertility. And while church teachings discouraged S3X during certain times, Sundays, fast days, holy festivals, many couples quietly ignored those rules. Communication between spouses was not always verbal. In cultures where emotions were rarely discussed openly, gestures carried meaning. A husband might bring his wife a piece of fruit or a carved trinket. A wife might mend her husband's clothes with extra care or leave a bit of meat aside from the stew. These acts, small, deliberate, were often the only expressions of affection people knew how to give. But not all marriages were gentle. Domestic violence was widespread, and it was often accepted as a man's right. In some legal codes, husbands were permitted to strike their wives for discipline, though excessive force could be punished, not necessarily for harming the woman, but for disrupting the community's sense of order. Still, many women had little protection, especially if they lacked family support. Even so, some couples developed strong, trusting bonds. We find traces of this in wills, where husbands leave their wives cherished tools, land, or livestock, signs of respect and shared labor. In letters, rare but revealing, some men wrote of missing their wives deeply when they traveled for work or war. Children were another part of the picture. They were often present in the home during moments of intimacy, especially in large families. Younger children might sleep near their parents, while older ones might turn away or pretend to sleep. It wasn't ideal, but it was reality, and it was understood. Conception was both a hope and a fear. Childbirth carried real danger. Many women died in labor. Midwives, often the only source of medical knowledge in rural areas, helped with births and also shared quiet wisdom about how to space pregnancies, through herbs, timing, or other folk methods, though none were reliable. But what happened when intimacy led to pregnancy outside of marriage? How were single women treated? What if the father disappeared or denied responsibility? That, too, was part of the hidden side of medieval life, one shaped by shame, secrecy, and difficult choices. In medieval society, a woman who became pregnant outside of marriage stepped into one of the most vulnerable positions imaginable. Her body, her name, even her child, all became subjects of judgment, rumor, and in many cases, punishment. There was no privacy. Villages were small. People noticed everything. And once a belly began to show, there was nowhere to hide. The church condemned fornication, S3X between unmarried people, as a grave sin. But it was the community, not the priest, who often delivered the harshest punishment. A young woman who gave birth out of wedlock might be called wicked, ruined, or spoiled. Her chances of marriage, already limited by her class or dowry, dropped sharply. Men were expected to marry virgins, and women who had been dishonored were often pushed to the edges of society. Sometimes the father would admit responsibility. In that case, he might be forced by the family, the village, or the church to marry the woman quickly, restoring her reputation. But many men denied involvement. Without witnesses or proof, a woman had little legal recourse. Her word was rarely enough, and when the father vanished or refused, the woman faced hard decisions. Some returned to their families and were quietly accepted, especially if the household needed labor or could absorb another child. Others were cast out, forced to beg or enter domestic service. A few turned to the only work available, prostitution, not out of desire, but out of necessity. In some towns, special homes were set aside for unwed mothers. These were not safe spaces in the modern sense. Often run by religious orders, they were places of shame and penance. Women were expected to repent, sometimes publicly, and might be kept isolated for months or even years. The child born there would often be taken away, sent to a foundling home or monastery. Infanticide, the killing of a newborn, was a terrible but tragically real response in desperate situations. Some women, facing the loss of everything, hid their pregnancies and abandoned their infants shortly after birth. The church responded harshly. In many places, hiding a pregnancy became a crime in itself. A woman whose child died in secret could be presumed guilty, even without proof. And yet, not all stories ended in despair. Some communities showed mercy. Midwives, often more practical than priests, would help deliver and protect the child without judgment. In rural areas, where labor was always needed, an unmarried mother might find work as a servant or field hand and raise her child with quiet dignity. Folk beliefs sometimes softened the edges of moral condemnation, seeing pregnancy as fate or the will of the stars, rather than purely a sin. Interestingly, children born out of wedlock, known as bastards in legal language, were not always doomed. In noble families, illegitimate sons of powerful men were sometimes acknowledged, even educated. They could not inherit lands or titles, but they might be given positions in the army, the church, or as household stewards. Their mothers, however, remained in the shadows. The stigma attached to unwed motherhood never fully disappeared. But beneath the layers of shame and silence, there were always people, women, neighbors, midwives, who tried to help, who saw the person, not just the sin. Still, the weight of morality was heavy, and it didn't fall evenly. Men who fathered children outside of marriage often faced little more than whispers. Women, meanwhile, bore the consequences on their bodies, their names, and their futures. But not all intimacy in the Middle Ages followed this pattern of punishment and shame. In some places, in some circumstances, love and desire were treated with a surprising degree of tolerance. That brings us to the quiet spaces where rules bent, customs softened, and affection found room to breathe. While the official voice of the church was strict and condemning, everyday life often told a more complex story. In towns and villages across medieval Europe, people found ways to navigate the narrow channels between rigid morality and human desire. Some spaces and customs allowed for a surprising degree of tolerance, even when the law and religion said otherwise. One such space was the market or festival. During special celebrations like May Day, harvest festivals, or local saints' days, the usual rules loosened. People danced, sang, drank, and mingled freely. Temporary freedoms allowed young men and women to meet without constant supervision, to flirt openly, and sometimes to share moments of intimacy that might otherwise be forbidden. These festivals were often deeply connected to older, pagan traditions that had survived beneath the surface of Christianity. They celebrated fertility, the cycles of nature, and community renewal. Even if the church disapproved, it sometimes tolerated these events, recognizing their importance to social cohesion. In some communities, informal unions existed alongside formal marriage. Known by different names across Europe, like handfasting in parts of England and Scotland, these were agreements to live together as husband and wife for a period of time, often a year and a day. If the couple chose to continue, the union might become permanent. If not, they parted without scandal. These arrangements provided a way for couples to test compatibility before committing fully, a concept modern audiences might recognize as a form of trial marriage. While not legally recognized everywhere, handfasting and similar customs allowed couples some freedom within a strict social framework. Additionally, towns often had quarters or neighborhoods known for looser morals. While brothels and prostitution were regulated, some women lived independently as mistresses or concubines of wealthy men, with varying degrees of social acceptance. These women navigated a delicate balance, often securing their survival and status through their connections. Love poetry and songs from the period sometimes celebrated passionate, even illicit love. Troubadours and minzingers sang of yearning and secret meetings. Though these were often idealized, they reflected real feelings and desires beneath the surface of strict rules. Marriage itself was not always the only acceptable path for romantic and sexual relationships. Widows and widowers could remarry, sometimes quickly, and remarriage was often necessary for survival. In some cases, older couples lived together peacefully without much pressure to have children. Social flexibility existed, especially in times and places where labor and alliances mattered more than strict morality. Of course, the church continued to preach against sins of the flesh, but it also recognized human frailty. Confessors often gave penance that was meant to guide rather than punish harshly. The threat of eternal damnation was balanced by the hope of forgiveness. Behind the scenes, individuals and communities negotiated their own versions of right and wrong. People found comfort in shared understanding, in gossip that tempered judgment, and in the rhythms of daily life that required compromise. Still, the tension between desire and doctrine never fully disappeared. What followed next in the story is how people lived, loved, and survived, navigating a world that was often harsh, unpredictable, and deeply human. In the world of medieval Europe, love was often seen as a luxury, something secondary to duty, family, and survival. Yet, beneath this practical surface, many couples developed deep emotional bonds that went far beyond obligation. These were not stories written in grand poems or sung by troubadours. Rather, they lived quietly in everyday moments of care and companionship. Marriage was, for many, a partnership of necessity. But within it, affection could grow through shared hardship and mutual support. Husbands and wives worked side by side in the fields or workshops. They bore children together, tended to the sick, and managed households. These shared experiences created a kind of intimacy rooted in trust and reliance. Letters between spouses, though rare from the lower classes, occasionally survive from noble families, revealing tenderness, concern, and even longing during long absences. A knight at war might write to his wife, expressing hope for her safety and the future. A noblewoman might send gifts or messages carried by trusted servants, speaking of hope, worry, or affection. Children played a role, too, in shaping family bonds. While large families were the norm and infant mortality was high, parents often formed strong attachments to their offspring. Mothers, in particular, were central to nurturing, both physically and emotionally, despite the hardships of daily life. Yet, love was not without its challenges. Social pressures, religious expectations, and economic hardship could strain relationships. Power imbalances, especially in noble marriages, sometimes left one partner feeling isolated or trapped. Still, many found ways to express their feelings, through small acts, secret glances, or moments of quiet comfort. In some cases, couples turned to shared religious devotion as a source of connection. Praying together, attending Mass, and observing fasts could reinforce bonds, providing a spiritual dimension to their partnership. The Church encouraged this, promoting the idea that marriage was not just a contract but a sacred union. Outside marriage, romantic love was often idealized in stories but complicated in real life. Courtly love, with its emphasis on chivalry, longing, and unattainable desire, influenced how people thought about affection. Though it was largely the domain of nobility, its themes filtered down through popular culture and folklore. At the same time, friendships and community ties provided emotional support. People relied on neighbors, extended family, and friends during times of joy and crisis. These networks were crucial for survival and emotional well-being. Understanding medieval intimacy means recognizing this complex mix of duty, desire, affection, and constraint. It was not always simple, nor was it always loving, but it was deeply human. As we continue, we will explore how these personal experiences intersected with larger social and legal structures, shaping the lives of medieval men and women in ways both subtle and profound. In medieval Europe, marriage was not just a personal matter. It was a public institution regulated by law, custom, and the Church. These forces shaped how couples formed, lived, and dissolved their unions, often limiting personal choice but ensuring social order. Canon law, the Church's legal system, defined marriage as a sacred and indissoluble bond. It set rules on consent, prohibitions on marrying close relatives, and requirements for public vows. These rules aimed to protect property rights, inheritance, and the legitimacy of children. One of the most significant principles was consent. Both parties had to agree freely to marry. Forced marriages, while common, were technically invalid under Church law. Yet, in practice, family pressures often overrode individual wishes. Customary law, local traditions, and practices also played a huge role. In some regions, local communities recognized informal unions or long-term cohabitation as legitimate. Disputes over land or inheritance sometimes hinged on whether a couple had lived together as husband and wife, regardless of formal ceremonies. Legal procedures around marriage varied widely. For example, bans, public announcements of an intended marriage, were meant to reveal any objections or impediments. Marriages conducted secretly could be challenged and annulled. When disputes arose over dowries, legitimacy, or marital obligations, courts became involved. Both secular and ecclesiastical courts handled these cases, often with overlapping jurisdictions. Punishments for violating marriage laws ranged from fines to excommunication. The Church's power extended deep into daily life, influencing not only what people could do but also what they thought was right. At the same time, economic factors shaped marital decisions. Marriage was often a way to secure alliances, property, and social status. Dowries, money, or goods brought by the bride, were crucial, and their loss or gain could have lasting effects. For peasants, marriages were sometimes simpler but no less important. Joining households meant sharing resources and labor. Communities kept a close eye on these unions, enforcing rules through social pressure as much as legal means. Despite all these regulations, people found ways to adapt. Love, desire, and necessity intertwined with law and custom, creating a complex social fabric. This balance between control and freedom, public duty and private feeling, continued to define medieval relationships, and it still resonates in many ways today. In the Middle Ages, medical knowledge about S3 was a curious mix of ancient texts, religious beliefs, and folk wisdom. Physicians and scholars drew heavily on the writings of Galen and Hippocrates, as well as the Bible and church teachings, creating an understanding of the body that was both scientific and moralistic. The human body was seen as governed by the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health depended on the balance of these fluids, and S3-Zool activity was believed to influence that balance. Too much or too little S3X was thought to cause illness, weakness, or madness. For men, S3X was often associated with strength and vitality, but excessive indulgence was warned against. For women, the ideas were more contradictory and confusing. The uterus, then called the womb, was thought to move within the body, sometimes causing hysteria or illness if not satisfied. This belief led to the idea that women needed S3-Zool release for health, but at the same time, female desire was seen as dangerous or sinful. Medieval medical texts advised men and women on when and how to engage in S3X, often prescribing certain positions, times of day, or even herbal remedies to aid fertility or avoid conception. The Church, however, strongly condemned any practices outside of procreative intercourse in the missionary position. Contraception was limited and often discouraged. Some herbs and potions were used as folk remedies, but their effectiveness was questionable, and church authorities often condemned their use as interfering with God's will. Midwives played a crucial role in women's health, assisting with childbirth and providing advice about fertility and S3-Zool matters. They held knowledge passed down through generations, mixing practical experience with superstition. Despite the many taboos, people were curious. Questions about pleasure, desire, and the mysteries of the body were whispered in private, shared between trusted friends, or even written about in secret manuscripts. This complex blend of science, religion, and folklore shaped how medieval people approached intimacy, sometimes with fear, sometimes with hope, but always with caution. As we continue, we will explore how these beliefs influenced the rituals and practices surrounding love and S3X in medieval society. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not only a legal and religious contract, but also a series of rituals deeply intertwined with notions of fertility, community, and intimacy. These customs reflected the hopes, fears, and social expectations surrounding the couple's new life together. Before the wedding, families often negotiated dowries and agreements that determined the couple's future. The ceremony itself was a public affair, usually held in a church, where vows were exchanged in the presence of witnesses. But the wedding day was far from over once the ceremony ended. Feasting, dancing, and celebrations followed, sometimes lasting several days. These events created an atmosphere of joy, but also a subtle pressure on the couple, especially the bride, to prove the success of their union. The bridal chamber held special significance. This was the private space where the marriage was to be consummated, marking the final step in the couple's joining. Sometimes, friends or family accompanied the couple to this room, ensuring the consummation would not be delayed. In certain noble households, it was even customary for witnesses to check the bed linens the following morning for proof of the bride's virginity. Symbols of fertility and prosperity often appeared during these celebrations. Rituals might include the breaking of bread, the sharing of wine, or the lighting of candles, all meant to bless the couple with abundance and the hope of children. In some regions, songs and dances incorporated themes of love and desire, mixing humor and seriousness in ways that brought people together while acknowledging the complexities of human relationships. Despite the Church's insistence on controlling S3-Zool behavior, medieval weddings recognized the importance of intimacy in marriage, not only for procreation but also as a foundation for the family and community. Understanding these traditions offers a glimpse into the delicate balance between public expectation and private experience, between duty and desire, that defined medieval life. Despite the Church's firm stance against interfering with procreation, medieval people found ways to control family size and delay childbirth. Contraception was not widely accepted, but practical needs often outweighed moral teachings, especially among peasants who depended on every member of the household to survive. Herbs and potions were the most common methods. Women used plants like rue, pennyroyal, and silphium, though silphium was rare and eventually became extinct. These herbs were believed to prevent conception or induce menstruation. Midwives often had secret knowledge of such remedies, passed down through generations. Coitus interruptus, or withdrawal, was another practiced method, though it required significant self-control and was not always reliable. Some couples also timed intercourse around the menstrual cycle, avoiding dangerous days to prevent pregnancy. The Church condemned these practices as sinful, believing that every act of S3X within marriage must be open to the possibility of life. Papal decrees and councils reinforced this teaching, sometimes prescribing severe penances for those caught using contraceptives. Despite this, historical records suggest that birth control was common, especially in towns and cities where economic pressures were greater. Women who wanted to avoid pregnancy had to balance their needs carefully against social expectations. Abortion, while illegal and dangerous, was also practiced. It was often done secretly, sometimes by midwives or women using herbal mixtures. The risks were high, including death, but for some, the alternative of poverty or social ruin was worse. Understanding these realities reveals a more nuanced picture of medieval sexuality, one where doctrine and daily life often conflicted, and where people made complex choices to survive and protect their families. Adultery was considered one of the gravest offenses in medieval society, threatening not only family honor but also social stability. Both church and secular authorities took measures to punish those who strayed from marital fidelity, though the severity and application of punishments varied widely across regions and classes. For women, the consequences were often harsher. A wife caught committing adultery risked public humiliation, physical punishment, or even banishment. In some areas, laws permitted husbands to enact corporal punishment, sometimes brutally. Public stocks or pillories were common for shaming offenders. Men, especially nobles, sometimes escaped such penalties or faced milder sanctions, reflecting a clear gender double standard. Their affairs with servants or mistresses were often overlooked or tacitly accepted, as long as they maintained their legitimate heirs. The Church's influence shaped not only laws but also social attitudes. Adultery was a sin that jeopardized the soul, and confessors imposed penances ranging from fasting and pilgrimage to public acts of contrition. Repeat offenders might be excommunicated, cutting them off from the community and sacraments. Despite strict teachings, adultery was widespread. Some extramarital relationships were secret, others were open secrets within courts or towns. Mistresses of powerful men sometimes wielded influence behind the scenes, complicating social dynamics. Communities often responded with gossip, ostracism, or attempts at reconciliation. Marriages could be annulled or separated due to infidelity, though such outcomes were rare and difficult to achieve. These complexities reveal how medieval society balanced moral ideals with human realities, weaving a fabric of rules, punishments, and unspoken tolerances that shaped intimate lives. In medieval Europe, marriage was often as much about property, alliances, and economic survival as it was about love or desire. Marriage contracts were carefully negotiated documents that set the terms for dowries, inheritances, and the distribution of wealth. Families arranged marriages to strengthen social standing, consolidate lands, or secure political power. Dowries, money, goods, or land brought by the bride were vital. They ensured the wife's financial security and served as a guarantee for her future. These contracts influenced not only the ceremony but also the daily life of the couple. For example, they determined who controlled property, how children's inheritances would be divided, and what rights each spouse had. In some cases, economic pressures affected intimacy. A husband might neglect his wife if he viewed her primarily as a financial burden. Conversely, a wife might seek favor or protection through affection or even secret relationships. Widows faced particular challenges. Without a husband, their legal and economic status could be precarious. Some remarried quickly to secure protection and livelihood, while others managed households and properties independently, defying some social norms. These economic realities shaped how people approached marriage and intimacy. Love and desire were present, but often entangled with practical concerns about survival, status, and family legacy. Understanding this context helps explain the complex motivations behind medieval relationships. Far from simple fairy tales, they were negotiations involving heart, body, and wealth. The medieval church was the primary institution shaping sexual morality in Europe. Its power extended far beyond spiritual guidance. It regulated behavior, set laws, and influenced daily life in profound ways. When it came to intimacy and S3X, the church's role was both controlling and deeply complicated. At the heart of church teaching was the belief that S3 Zool activity had one primary purpose: procreation within the bounds of marriage. Any act outside this framework was labeled sinful, whether it was premarital, extramarital, homosexual, or non-procreative. The church's stance was clear and uncompromising, but enforcing this ideal was a continuous challenge. Confession became a central tool for control. The requirement for annual confession gave priests insight into their parishioners' most private lives, turning individual guilt into a social mechanism. Penances assigned for S3 Zool sins ranged widely, from simple prayers and fasting to long pilgrimages or public acts of repentance. Yet, the church's own members sometimes struggled with these rules. Stories of clerical misconduct, concubinage, and hidden families circulated widely, revealing a tension between ideals and reality. This hypocrisy undermined the church's moral authority in the eyes of many, even as it continued to dictate norms. The church also used its influence to shape laws around marriage and family life. Ecclesiastical courts dealt with issues like annulments, legitimacy of children, and inheritance disputes. These courts operated alongside secular ones, creating a complex legal environment that governed intimate relationships. Beyond formal mechanisms, the church influenced social attitudes through preaching, art, and education. Visual depictions of the 7 deadly sins, including lust, reinforced fear of S3 Zool transgression. Moral treatises warned against the dangers of desire and the devil's temptations. At the same time, the church offered frameworks for understanding love and marriage that went beyond mere duty. The idea of spiritual companionship and mutual support between spouses was promoted, reflecting a more nuanced view of human relationships. However, these teachings often conflicted with lived experience. Human desire, economic necessity, and social customs frequently clashed with ecclesiastical ideals. People negotiated this tension in their daily lives, sometimes through secret liaisons, sometimes through quiet acceptance. In this way, the church's influence was both pervasive and imperfect. It shaped medieval society's views on intimacy and morality, but also had to contend with the complexities of human nature. As we move forward, we will explore how these religious and social forces played out in the lives of ordinary people, in their homes, communities, and relationships. Medieval life was structured around the rhythms of the church calendar, agricultural cycles, and community festivals. These events were much more than mere celebrations. They were moments when everyday social norms, including strict rules around intimacy and behavior, were loosened or temporarily suspended. Festivals like Carnival, May Day, and harvest celebrations offered the chance for communities to gather, to feast, to dance, and to let go of the usual restraints. For a few days, the rigid order of medieval society seemed to melt away, replaced by joy, mischief, and an atmosphere that encouraged closeness and sometimes even romance. Carnival, in particular, was a time of inversion. Social roles could be reversed, with peasants mocking nobles and clergy in satirical plays and parodies. Masks and costumes allowed people to hide their identities and explore behaviors that would otherwise be forbidden. These moments of freedom fostered connections across social boundaries and allowed desires to surface more openly. May Day celebrations honored fertility and the coming of spring. Dancing around the maypole, singing, and courtship rituals were central to these events. Young people often used the occasion to meet potential partners in a more relaxed setting, away from parental oversight. Folk songs and dances incorporated themes of love, longing, and playful teasing, creating a communal space where intimacy could blossom. In some regions, customs like rough music, noisy, ritualized public shaming of offenders, reminded people of the consequences of breaking social and sexual rules. Yet, even these strict practices were part of a larger system that balanced punishment with communal cohesion. These festivals connected deeply to older pre-Christian traditions, pagan rituals celebrating fertility, renewal, and the cycles of nature survived beneath the Christian surface. The Church often tolerated or adapted these customs, understanding their importance to community life and stability. Within this festive context, forbidden relationships sometimes flourished. Secret meetings, flirtations, and even illicit encounters were more common during these times. While risky, such moments offered people a brief respite from daily hardships and strictures. Yet, when the festival ended, the normal order returned. Public morality was restored, and individuals who had stepped too far could face serious consequences. The tension between freedom and control played out repeatedly, shaping the lived experience of medieval people. These cycles of restriction and release reveal a dynamic society where intimacy was negotiated not only through law and religion but also through culture and tradition. Understanding these festive moments gives us insight into how medieval people balanced desire, community, and survival in a complex world. Marriage in the Middle Ages was often less about romantic love and more about alliance, strategy, and survival. Families, especially among the nobility and wealthy merchants, arranged unions to secure political power, consolidate lands, and improve social standing. These arranged marriages shaped not only the public but also the intimate lives of those involved. Parents and guardians typically negotiated terms well before the couple met. Dowries, inheritances, and future prospects were weighed carefully. Love, if it appeared later, was considered a fortunate addition rather than a prerequisite. For many couples, the first meetings were formal and cautious. Personal feelings were secondary to family interests. Yet, this did not mean affection was absent. Over time, many spouses developed bonds of companionship, respect, and even tenderness. Shared experiences of hardship, child-rearing, and community responsibilities fostered emotional connections. The ideal of courtly love, the refined, often secret admiration of a noblewoman by a knight, coexisted uneasily with arranged marriages. Courtly love emphasized passion, longing, and unfulfilled desire, often outside the bounds of marriage. It shaped literature and cultural expectations but was rarely the reality of most marriages. Among common folk, marriages could be less formal but no less binding. Economic necessity often dictated the timing and choice of partner. Love might grow after marriage or not at all. Divorce was rare and difficult, leaving many couples bound by circumstance rather than affection. Widowhood presented both challenges and opportunities. Widows had some legal rights and could remarry, sometimes choosing partners more freely than before. Remarriage was common and practical, helping maintain households and social ties. Within these complex social structures, love found ways to express itself, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly. Poetry, songs, and letters reveal glimpses of genuine emotion amid duty and expectation. Understanding the balance between arranged marriage, alliance, and love helps illuminate the intimate world of medieval people, where personal feelings navigated the currents of family, society, and survival. In medieval Europe, the experience of intimacy and sexual behavior was shaped heavily by the environment, whether one lived in a bustling town or a quiet village. These settings offered very different contexts for how people navigated desire, social expectations, and community scrutiny. Towns, with their growing populations and more diverse communities, often had a more complex social fabric. Markets, guilds, and public spaces brought people into frequent contact, creating opportunities for courtship, but also for gossip and surveillance. The relative anonymity of urban life sometimes allowed for greater freedom, but it also meant that scandals could spread quickly. Regulations in towns aimed to control public morality. Authorities might enforce curfews, restrict gatherings, or punish public displays of affection. Prostitution was often tolerated but strictly regulated, sometimes confined to specific districts. Brothels provided a controlled outlet for male desire, with rules about who could work and how business was conducted. In contrast, village life was marked by close-knit communities where everyone knew each other's affairs. Privacy was scarce. Family reputations were paramount, and social control was often exercised through informal means like gossip, community pressure, or collective punishment. Despite these controls, human behavior remained diverse. Courtship rituals varied widely, influenced by local customs, economic conditions, and individual circumstances. Public celebrations, market days, and religious festivals offered chances for young people to meet away from parental eyes. Sexual behavior outside marriage was generally frowned upon, but enforcement was uneven. Some communities were harsh, while others showed more leniency, particularly when economic or demographic factors made strict punishment impractical. Marriage was central to social order, but people also found ways to express desire and affection within and outside its bounds. Love songs, folk tales, and local legends often reflected the tension between social norms and personal longing. Understanding these differences between urban and rural settings provides a fuller picture of medieval intimacy. It shows how context shaped not only behavior but also the meanings attached to love, sex, and relationships. As we continue, we will explore how these social dynamics played out in specific communities and moments of personal life. In medieval society, marriage was a communal affair, deeply embedded in the social fabric and public life. The ceremonies, rituals, and customs surrounding weddings were as much about affirming social bonds as about uniting two individuals. Marriage ceremonies typically took place in a church, emphasizing the sacred nature of the union. The exchange of vows before witnesses, the blessing by a priest, and the celebration that followed served to legitimize the couple's relationship in the eyes of God and society. Community participation was essential. Neighbors, family members, and local officials gathered not only to celebrate, but also to witness the contract being formed. This public aspect made it difficult to hide or deny the union later, providing social stability. The wedding feast was an important social event. Food, drink, music, and dancing marked the joyous occasion. However, beneath the festivities lay expectations. The bride was to prove her virginity, and the couple was expected to begin procreating promptly. These expectations reinforced social order and continuity. Various customs highlighted the transition from singlehood to married life. The bride's attire, often white or another symbolic color, represented purity. Processions, gift-giving, and specific dances celebrated fertility and good fortune. Community members often held the couple accountable for their behavior. Gossip and social pressure ensured adherence to norms, particularly regarding fidelity and the proper conduct of intimacy. At the same time, weddings could be moments of negotiation. Disputes over dowries or family alliances sometimes surfaced, reflecting the complex intertwining of personal and economic interests. Through these ceremonies and customs, medieval society reinforced its values and ensured the continuation of social structures. The public and performative nature of marriage shaped how intimacy was experienced and understood. Recognizing the communal context of marriage helps us see medieval intimacy not just as private acts but as expressions of broader social relations. In the medieval world, women's experiences of intimacy were shaped by a complex mix of social expectations, economic realities, and cultural norms. Their roles ranged from dutiful wives and mothers to midwives, healers, and sometimes marginalized figures struggling for survival. Marriage was often the primary framework for women's sexual and social lives. They were expected to be obedient spouses, bear children, and manage households. Virginity before marriage was highly prized, tied to family honor and the legitimacy of offspring. This emphasis placed considerable pressure on young women, influencing how they understood and navigated their own bodies and desires. However, women were not merely passive participants. They exercised agency within their roles. Midwives, for example, held specialized knowledge about childbirth, contraception, and women's health. They served as trusted advisors, often helping women navigate the complexities of pregnancy, fertility, and S3-Zool relations in a world dominated by male authority. Economic factors also played a significant role. Widows, especially those who inherited property or businesses, could attain a degree of independence uncommon for women in other contexts. Some managed estates, engaged in trade, or remarried strategically to secure their livelihoods. Despite these possibilities, women faced harsh realities. Accusations of adultery, witchcraft, or moral transgression could ruin reputations and lives. Legal protections were limited, and women often bore the brunt of social punishments for S3 behavior deemed improper. Intimacy for women was thus entwined with survival, reputation, and power. Their personal desires and experiences were frequently overshadowed by the demands of family, church, and society. Yet, within these constraints, women found ways to express affection, maintain relationships, and assert influence. Literary and historical records sometimes reveal women's voices through letters, poetry, or legal documents, offering glimpses into their perspectives on love, desire, and sexuality. Understanding women's experiences helps paint a fuller picture of medieval intimacy, revealing the human complexity beneath social roles and norms. In medieval society, men were expected to fulfill specific roles and responsibilities within the realms of intimacy, marriage, and family. Their social status, economic power, and personal identity were often closely tied to their capacity to maintain households, produce heirs, and uphold honor. Marriage for men was not just a personal choice but a social contract. They were expected to protect and provide for their wives and children, ensuring the continuation of family lines and the management of property. Producing legitimate heirs was critical. Failure could threaten the stability of estates and alliances. Sexual behavior outside marriage was often treated with a double standard. While men were expected to be faithful in formal terms, their extramarital affairs, especially with lower-class women or servants, were frequently overlooked or tolerated. Such relationships, while socially complex, reflected the gendered dynamics of power and privilege. Men's experiences of intimacy were shaped by expectations of masculinity and honor. The ability to perform sexually and to control one's household were markers of status. At the same time, men faced pressures and anxieties around fertility, lineage, and reputation. Social institutions, including guilds, courts, and the church, influenced men's behavior through laws, moral teachings, and community oversight. Men who transgressed norms risked legal penalties, public shaming, or spiritual consequences. Yet, men also engaged in genuine affection and emotional bonds. Letters, poetry, and historical accounts reveal relationships filled with tenderness, loyalty, and desire. These human aspects often coexisted with social roles and obligations. Understanding men's roles and experiences adds depth to our picture of medieval intimacy, showing how personal feelings intersected with societal expectations. Extramarital relationships in the Middle Ages were a complex reality, existing alongside strict religious doctrines and social expectations. These liaisons took many forms, from secret affairs to openly acknowledged mistresses, and were influenced by personal desire, social structure, and economic conditions. One common cause of extramarital affairs was the practical separation of spouses due to war, travel, or work. Knights and soldiers could be away for years, leaving spouses vulnerable to loneliness and temptation. Similarly, merchants and officials who traveled frequently sometimes maintained relationships outside marriage. Social hierarchies also played a role. Nobles often kept mistresses, whose status varied from secret lovers to semi-official companions. These relationships could provide emotional support or political advantage, but also risked scandal and conflict. For common people, extramarital affairs were more discreet but still significant. Secret relationships might offer affection missing in arranged marriages or provide comfort during hard times. However, discovery could lead to serious consequences, especially for women. The Church condemned adultery and fornication harshly, considering them sins with spiritual and social penalties. Secular laws sometimes imposed fines, corporal punishment, or public humiliation. Yet enforcement was inconsistent, often influenced by local customs and social status. Despite risks, extramarital relationships were woven into the fabric of medieval life. They reveal the tension between idealized morality and lived experience, highlighting human desires that persisted even under strict control. These affairs also affected family dynamics, inheritance disputes, and community relations. Children born outside marriage faced uncertain status, and their existence complicated social order. Understanding extramarital relationships enriches our view of medieval intimacy, showing how personal needs and social structures intertwined in complex ways. Medieval society often portrayed S3 through the lens of sin and procreation, yet beneath this moral framework, human beings experienced a complex range of desires, pleasures, and fears. Sensuality was both celebrated and condemned, creating a landscape full of contradictions. The Church preached that S3 was primarily for reproduction, but many medieval texts, poetry, and art suggest a more nuanced reality. Literature from troubadours, minzingers, and court poets often celebrated desire, flirtation, and the pleasures of the flesh, though usually couched in allegory or caution. Pleasure was understood as a natural part of life, but also as a potential danger. Excessive indulgence risked sin, disease, or moral corruption. The concept of moderation was central. Balance between desire and restraint was idealized. Taboos shaped what was acceptable. Homosexuality, masturbation, and non-procreative acts were condemned by the Church and society. Such behaviors could lead to severe punishments, including excommunication or legal penalties. Nevertheless, records show that people engaged in these acts, sometimes secretly, sometimes openly depending on time and place. Folk beliefs, medical theories, and social attitudes all influenced perceptions of pleasure and taboo. The tension between desire and prohibition affected personal relationships and community dynamics. People navigated these boundaries with caution, humor, and sometimes rebellion. Understanding the interplay of sensuality and taboo in medieval times reveals a world where pleasure existed alongside fear and control, a human reality that resonates across centuries. In medieval society, sexual education was informal, fragmented, and often shrouded in secrecy. Unlike today's structured systems, knowledge about the body, reproduction, and intimacy was passed down through family members, midwives, religious instruction, and folk traditions. Parents rarely spoke openly about sex with their children. Instead, lessons were implicit, delivered through stories, warnings, and observation. Young people learned about marriage and reproduction mainly from their communities and religious teachings, which emphasized morality and sin. Midwives played a crucial role as informal educators. Their practical experience allowed them to advise women on pregnancy, childbirth, and fertility, blending medical knowledge with cultural beliefs. However, midwives' expertise was often mistrusted or marginalized by the male-dominated medical establishment and church authorities. Religious institutions taught sexual restraint, focusing on chastity before marriage and fidelity afterward. Confession provided a venue for discussing sexual matters, though often in terms of sin and guilt rather than health or pleasure. Written materials on sex were rare and typically intended for clergy or medical professionals. These texts combined classical medical theories with religious doctrine, rarely addressing the lived experiences of ordinary people. Folk knowledge filled many gaps. Herbal remedies, superstitions, and customs helped individuals navigate the mysteries of desire, conception, and childbirth. Such knowledge was passed through generations, often orally, and varied by region. The lack of formal education contributed to myths and misunderstandings about the body and sex. Ideas about humors, spirits, and divine will shaped how people perceived their own experiences. Understanding medieval sexual education reveals a world where knowledge was fragmented, controlled, and intertwined with morality. This shaped how intimacy was experienced, regulated, and understood in everyday life. Medieval Europe's calendar was marked by numerous religious and cultural festivals that shaped not only public worship but also private lives, including intimacy and relationships. These celebrations provided rhythm and meaning to the year, intertwining faith, community, and human connection. Religious festivals such as Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost were central to medieval life. They involved communal prayers, feasts, and rituals, reinforcing spiritual values and social bonds. The Church often used these occasions to preach about morality, including sexual conduct, emphasizing chastity, marriage, and fidelity. Yet, alongside official observance, many festivals incorporated older customs linked to fertility, renewal, and the cycles of nature. For example, Easter celebrations included symbols of rebirth, While May Day marked the arrival of spring and was associated with courtship and fertility rites, these festivals allowed for moments of relaxation from everyday strictness. Communities gathered to sing, dance, and share food, creating opportunities for socializing and courtship, especially among youth. The festive atmosphere often loosened social restraints, encouraging flirtation and, at times, more intimate encounters. Some festivals involved specific rituals aimed at promoting fertility and prosperity. These could include symbolic dances, the blessing of fields and animals, or the exchange of gifts and tokens between couples. The church attempted to regulate and sometimes suppress pagan elements within these celebrations, but many survived or were adapted into Christian forms. This blending reflected the resilience of popular culture and the importance of communal life. Understanding the role of festivals helps us see how medieval people negotiated their desires and social obligations within a framework that combined religious devotion and cultural tradition. These moments of celebration were vital spaces where intimacy, community, and faith intersected, shaping the texture of medieval life. Sexual taboos in medieval Europe were deeply rooted in religious doctrine, social order, and cultural norms. These prohibitions shaped what was considered acceptable behavior, defining the boundaries between virtue and sin, community and exclusion. Among the most severe taboos were incest, bestiality, sodomy, and adultery. Each was viewed as not only a moral failing but also a threat to the social fabric. The Church condemned these acts vehemently, associating them with spiritual corruption and divine punishment. Incest prohibitions were strictly enforced by both church and secular laws. Marriages within certain degrees of kinship were invalid and could be annulled. These rules served practical purposes, preventing consolidation of power and maintaining clear lines of inheritance, but also reflected moral concerns about family purity. Sodomy, broadly defined to include various non-procreative acts, was harshly punished. Accusations could lead to trials, imprisonment, or even execution, though enforcement varied widely by region and period. The fear of such transgressions was often used to reinforce social discipline. Adultery, as previously discussed, attracted social and legal penalties, particularly for women. Punishments ranged from public humiliation to physical chastisement, reflecting gendered power dynamics. Bestiality was seen as a grave sin and crime, though records of prosecutions are less common. It symbolized a breach of natural and divine order, provoking fear and disgust. Punishments for sexual transgressions served as public warnings, reinforcing norms and deterring others. Trials, confessions, and public penance were part of a system that sought to maintain moral order. However, despite strict rules, violations occurred, revealing the complexity of human behavior. Some transgressions were met with secrecy, others with tolerance, depending on social status and community context. Understanding sexual taboos and their enforcement helps illuminate medieval society's attempts to control bodies, desires, and relationships, balancing fear, power, and human complexity. In the Middle Ages, love poetry and literature played a significant role in shaping ideas about romance, desire, and intimacy. These cultural expressions offered both an idealized and sometimes subversive view of relationships that contrasted with the rigid norms imposed by society and the church. Courtly love, a literary and cultural phenomenon that flourished especially among the nobility, celebrated refined passion and adoration, often directed toward an unattainable or married noblewoman. This concept emphasized chivalry, devotion, and the ennobling power of love, sometimes outside of marriage. Troubadours and minzingers composed poems and songs that explored themes of longing, beauty, suffering, and secret affection. Their works were performed in courts and noble households, influencing the social imagination and creating a vocabulary for expressing desire. While courtly love idealized romantic longing, it rarely translated into physical relationships, reflecting the tension between social constraints and human emotion. The emphasis was often on spiritual and emotional connection rather than consummation. Religious literature also engaged with themes of love, sometimes drawing parallels between divine love and human passion. Mystical writings used the language of intimacy and desire to describe the soul's relationship with God. Popular literature, including folk tales and romances, portrayed a variety of love stories, from tragic to comic, that resonated with broader audiences. These narratives reflected hopes, fears, and moral lessons related to love and S3-zuality. Through literature, medieval people explored the complexities of intimacy, negotiating between duty, desire, and social expectations. These works enriched cultural life and offered avenues for personal reflection. Understanding the literary traditions of the Middle Ages reveals how ideas about love and intimacy evolved, shaping not only individual experiences but also societal attitudes. In medieval Europe, marriages among the nobility were strategic tools for consolidating power, forging alliances, and securing territories. These unions were less about personal affection and more about political calculation, with profound impacts on both public and private lives. Noble families negotiated marriages to strengthen claims to lands, titles, and influence. Dowries, inheritances, and political promises were bargained over in detail, often years in advance. The bride and groom were frequently children or teenagers, expected to fulfill roles assigned by family interests. Political marriages shaped court life and diplomacy. The presence of a bride from a powerful family could bring new alliances or peace between rival factions. Conversely, failed marriages or infidelities could spark conflicts and destabilize regions. Within these arrangements, the intimate lives of noble couples were constrained by expectations of duty and legacy. Producing heirs, particularly male heirs, was paramount. The pressure to secure succession influenced daily life, relationships, and even personal freedoms. Despite the political nature of these unions, some couples formed genuine emotional bonds, sharing companionship, affection, and mutual respect. Letters and chronicles reveal moments of tenderness amidst political obligations. At the same time, extramarital relationships were common, especially for men. Mistresses, concubines, and secret alliances played roles in court intrigue and family dynamics, sometimes complicating inheritance and legitimacy. Political marriages thus intertwined personal intimacy with the broader dynamics of power, shaping medieval history as well as private lives. Understanding this connection reveals the complex negotiations of love, duty, and authority in the noble world. Monastic life in the Middle Ages represented an alternative path to worldly existence, profoundly shaping ideas about intimacy and sexuality. Men and women who took religious vows embraced celibacy, renouncing marriage and S3-zul relations as part of their spiritual commitment. Monasteries and convents were centers of prayer, learning, and community life, where celibacy was both a personal discipline and a communal norm. This rejection of S3-zuality was seen as a way to purify the soul, focusing entirely on the divine. The Church promoted celibacy as an ideal, considering it superior to married life in spiritual terms. Religious leaders taught that S3-zul desire was a source of temptation and sin, best overcome through discipline and devotion. However, the reality within monastic communities was more complicated. Historical records reveal occasional violations of vows, clandestine relationships, and struggles with desire among monks and nuns. Such transgressions were met with strict penalties, including penance, confinement, or expulsion. Monasteries also played a role in shaping broader societal attitudes toward sexuality. They preserved texts on theology, medicine, and philosophy that influenced views on the body and desire. The tension between celibacy and human nature was a persistent theme, reflected in sermons, literature, and art. This dynamic shaped how medieval people understood the spiritual dangers and moral challenges of intimacy. Furthermore, monastic communities offered models of idealized purity and self-control that contrasted with the complexities of married life. These examples influenced laypeople's behavior and ideals. Understanding the role of religious vows and monasticism helps reveal the diverse ways medieval society negotiated sexuality, balancing earthly desires with spiritual aspirations. Childbearing was a central concern in medieval life, entwined with survival, lineage, and social order. Fertility was both a blessing and a mystery, surrounded by practices and beliefs that combined medical knowledge, superstition, and religious faith. Women bore the primary burden of reproduction, facing the risks of pregnancy and childbirth in a time of limited medical understanding. Midwives played crucial roles, guiding expectant mothers through labor and employing herbal remedies to ease pain or complications. Fertility was often seen as a divine gift, yet people also believed in various earthly influences. Superstitions abounded. Charms, prayers, and rituals aimed to enhance fertility or protect against miscarriage. Some believed that certain foods, behaviors, or even emotions could affect conception. Medical texts of the time incorporated classical theories, such as the humoral system, attributing fertility to the balance of bodily fluids. Treatments might involve diet, baths, or herbal concoctions designed to restore harmony. Infertility was a source of social distress, especially for noble families concerned with heirs. In some cases, marriages were annulled due to childlessness, highlighting the high stakes of fertility. Religious ceremonies, such as blessings for conception or prayers to saints, reflected the intertwining of faith and reproduction. Pilgrimages to holy sites were undertaken in hopes of divine intervention. Beyond practical concerns, cultural narratives celebrated fertility and childbirth through art, literature, and festivals, reinforcing their importance to community and continuity. These beliefs and practices reveal a medieval world grappling with the challenges of reproduction, blending knowledge, faith, and hope in the face of uncertainty. Prostitution was a persistent and complex feature of medieval urban life, existing within a web of economic, social, and moral dynamics. Despite official condemnation by the church and secular authorities, it was often tolerated and regulated as a necessary evil to maintain social order. In many cities, prostitutes lived and worked in designated districts or quarters, sometimes called red light areas. These zones allowed authorities to monitor and control activities, reducing the spread of disease and public disorder. Brothels were licensed in some places, with fees paid to municipal governments. Women engaged in prostitution for a variety of reasons: poverty, lack of alternatives, coercion, or as a temporary means of survival. The profession carried significant risks, including disease, violence, and social stigma. Yet, it also offered some women financial independence and a degree of autonomy rare for medieval women. Clients ranged from peasants and laborers to merchants and nobles. Prostitution fulfilled social functions by providing an outlet for male sexual desire, which was seen as a way to protect marital fidelity and social stability. Regulation varied widely by region and period. Authorities might impose curfews, require health inspections, or restrict interactions. Religious reformers frequently called for stricter measures, associating prostitution with moral decay. The presence of prostitution influenced literature, art, and popular culture, often symbolizing sin but also human vulnerability. Discussions about prostitution intersected with broader debates about morality, gender roles, and social control. Understanding the role of prostitution sheds light on the realities of medieval sexuality beyond idealized norms. It reveals a society negotiating desires, economic pressures, and moral imperatives in daily life. Family life in the Middle Ages was a central arena where intimacy and sexuality were lived, negotiated, and regulated. While marriage and procreation were core functions, the dynamics between spouses and the upbringing of children added layers of complexity to domestic life. Spouses often entered marriage with expectations shaped by social norms and personal experiences. While duty and alliance were primary motivations, many couples developed emotional bonds, companionship, and physical affection over time. Letters and chronicles occasionally reveal tenderness and mutual respect, even in arranged marriages. The sexual relationship between husband and wife was largely viewed through the lens of procreation and morality. However, pleasure and desire were not absent. Medieval medical texts sometimes acknowledged the benefits of mutual satisfaction for health and marital harmony. Parental roles were clearly defined, with fathers typically responsible for economic provision and legal authority, while mothers managed the household and child-rearing. Mothers played a crucial role in educating children about social and moral expectations, often preparing them for their own future roles in family and society. Children were expected to learn chastity and obedience, with their early experiences shaped by family, church, and community. Education about sexuality was indirect and often conveyed through example, discipline, and religious instruction. Discipline within the family could be strict, reflecting broader societal hierarchies and norms. Yet love, care, and affection were integral, contributing to family cohesion and survival. The household was also a site where gender roles and power dynamics played out daily, influencing how intimacy was expressed and experienced. Understanding the family context is essential for grasping medieval intimacy, revealing how personal relationships were intertwined with social order, cultural values, and human emotions. Medieval medical knowledge about sex and health was deeply influenced by ancient theories, religious beliefs, and limited empirical observation. Physicians and scholars combined ideas from Galen, Hippocrates, and Aristotle with Christian doctrine to create a framework that shaped understandings of the body, reproduction, and sexuality. Central to medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, whose balance was thought to determine health and temperament. Sexual activity was believed to affect this balance, with moderation encouraged to maintain bodily harmony. Sex was considered necessary for reproduction but potentially harmful if excessive. Medical texts warned against overindulgence, associating it with weakness, disease, and moral decline. Yet, sex was also recognized for its role in health, vitality, and marital harmony. Physicians addressed issues such as infertility, impotence, menstruation, and pregnancy complications, often recommending herbal remedies, dietary changes, and lifestyle adjustments. Midwives played a complementary role, providing practical care during childbirth and advising on women's health. Sexual diseases, including what we now know as sexually transmitted infections, were poorly understood but feared. Treatments were limited and often based on superstition or crude remedies. The medical establishment's views were shaped by gendered assumptions, with distinct expectations and diagnoses for men and women. Women's bodies were often seen as more fragile and mysterious, contributing to social attitudes toward female sexuality. Despite limitations, medieval medicine contributed to ongoing discussions about sexuality, health, and morality, influencing both elite and popular perspectives. Understanding these medical views reveals how science, culture, and religion intersected in shaping medieval experiences of intimacy and well-being. Courtship in medieval times was a carefully choreographed process, governed by social norms, family interests, and religious expectations. Unlike modern dating, it involved a series of rituals and interactions that balanced personal desire with public reputation and familial approval. Young men and women typically met through community gatherings, church events, or festivals. Opportunities to interact were limited and closely supervised, especially for women whose virtue was highly protected. Gift-giving was a common part of courtship. Tokens such as flowers, ribbons, or small trinkets symbolized affection and intentions. Poetry and song, often performed by traveling troubadours or local minstrels, conveyed romantic messages and social cues. Public displays of affection were restrained. Instead, subtle gestures, coded language, and indirect communication allowed suitors to express interest while maintaining decorum. Families played a significant role, negotiating marriages and ensuring alliances that would benefit social standing and economic security. Parental consent was often essential before courtship could progress. Despite these controls, young people found ways to express genuine feelings. Secret meetings, exchanged letters, and whispered conversations added intimacy to the formal process. Religious teachings emphasized chastity and the sanctity of marriage, framing courtship as a path toward a lifelong, faithful union. Understanding these rituals reveals how medieval people navigated the tension between societal expectations and personal desires, creating a rich tapestry of love, duty, and hope. Looking back on the intricate tapestry of medieval intimacy, we see a world shaped by paradoxes. Where love and duty intertwined, desire and discipline coexisted, and personal feelings were inseparable from social structures. Sexuality in the Middle Ages was neither simple nor uniform. It was governed by religious teachings, social hierarchies, cultural traditions, and human needs. Marriage served as the cornerstone, yet beyond its formal boundaries, Human passions found expression in poetry, secret liaisons, and the rhythms of daily life. Women and men navigated roles filled with expectations and constraints, yet both sought connection, pleasure, and meaning. Communities imposed norms, but individual experiences varied widely. The legacy of medieval intimacy echoes in our modern understandings of love, gender, and sexuality. It reminds us that human relationships are complex, shaped by history, culture, and personal stories. As we close this exploration, we are invited to reflect on how past societies balanced order and freedom, morality and desire. The medieval world, with all its challenges and contradictions, offers valuable insights into the enduring nature of human intimacy. Thank you for joining this journey into the hidden history of how sex actually happened in the Middle Ages.